What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my Week 1 wide receiver start sits. If you missed it yesterday, I went through my Week 1 running back start sits, so go check that one out after this one if you haven't seen it already. But for my start sit videos, I just, don't focus on a few players. I'm going to dive into every single Week 1 matchup, so all 16 games. I'm going to be talking about every single fantasy relevant wide receiver, and I'm going to be listing them as either a start, a fringe option, or a sit. The starts, these are players that I feel very confident with in my lineup. I feel good slotting them in to be my wide receiver 1 or my wide receiver 2. The fringe options, maybe I don't love them in my lineup, but I think they're solid, decent flex options for this week. And then sits, pretty self-explanatory here. These are players that I'd prefer to keep on my bench. I think week 1 is always very interesting for the start sits. We don't know exactly how things are going to shake out. There may be some players I really like long-term, but maybe I don't love them as much here in week 1. If you guys enjoyed the video, do me a huge favor, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And let's just dive right into it. So we're going to be starting off with the first game of the week. We have the Chiefs taking on the Lions. And starting off here with the Lions, this is just going to be like a one wide receiver team pretty much. Amon-Ra St. Brown, he's a locked-in start. I don't really think anyone else on this team is going to be fantasy relevant at the wide receiver position. I guess you could throw J-Mo in there once he is off of his suspension. But right now, this is Amon-Ra, and he is very clearly a start. Then on the other side with the Chiefs, I have Sky Moore listed as a fringe option, and then I'm going to be sitting the rest of these wide receivers. I do think this Chiefs wide receiver room is pretty up in the air. I think that if everyone is healthy, their top 3 would be Sky Moore, Kadarius Toney, and MVS. Kadarius Toney is back at practice, but I don't think there's any guarantee he's going to be playing Thursday, or even if he does play, that he's going to have like 100% of his role. He really has struggled to stay on the field, and he's also struggled that even when he is on the field, he's not a guy who has a crazy high route participation. So if I had to choose one wide receiver to roster from this Chiefs team, it would be Sky Moore. Heading into a second season, I do think he can have a nice year 2 breakout here. Looking at this matchup here for the Chiefs, they are number 1 in implied points, and they're also going up against the Lions, who have allowed the third most fantasy points to wide receivers last season in 2022. So a pretty strong matchup. Someone is going to produce from this wide receiver room. If I had to make a bet, it would be on Sky Moore, which is why I have him as like a fringe option here. Now moving over to the Sunday slate of games, we have the Panthers taking on the Falcons. Not a super exciting matchup at the wide receiver position. For the Panthers, I don't feel confident starting any of these guys, whether it's Thielen, Mingo, or DJ Chark if he is healthy. They're all going to be sits for me. Pretty low on Adam Thielen. I just think we're at the point of his career where he's kind of fallen off. I don't think he's going to be super fantasy relevant. If I had to roster one wide receiver here, it would pretty easily be Mingo. You're just kind of taking the shot on the rookie wide receiver, hoping he breaks out. But in week 1, I would definitely just be avoiding this wide receiver room altogether. Looking at the Falcons, I do have Drake London as a start here. I am pretty high on Drake London heading into this season. He's a guy who just is going to need competent quarterback play to give you really solid production. He doesn't need Desmond Ridder to be great. He just needs him to not be terrible like Mariota was last season. So I do think Drake London's a solid fringe wide receiver 2 start here in week 1. In the next matchup, we have the Texans taking on the Ravens, and I'm actually going to have no starts and no fringe options in this matchup. Starting off with the Texans, if I were to roster a wide receiver from this team, it would be Nico Collins. But week 1, you're probably drafting Nico Collins as your wide receiver 5, your wide receiver 6. I would hope you have better options, so he will be a sit for me. And then for the Ravens, I'm very interested in all 3 of these Ravens wide receivers in terms of season long, throughout the season. Very high on Zay Flowers, very high on Rashad Bateman, not as high on OBJ, but I still think, he is kind of interesting for fantasy. But I just don't really want any of these guys in my lineup here in week 1. I'd rather, just kind of see how week 1 plays out. How does this offense look? What's the playing time looking like? Is it OBJ and Bateman in 2 wide receiver sets? Is it OBJ and Flowers? Is it Flowers and Bateman? There are still some questions that need to be answered with this wide receiver room. Looking at this matchup with the Texans, the Ravens are double-digit favorites. They should have a lot of success on the ground. We saw the Texans just get shredded, by opposing running backs last season. So I don't even think this is going to be a crazy great matchup for these wide receivers. So that's why I'm kind of just willing to wait and see how it plays out. and I would definitely not be surprised if I have 1, 2, maybe even 3 of these guys listed as like fringe options or better heading into week 2. But week 1, would hope there are better options out there. If you're forced to start one of these guys, like I don't think it's the end of the world, but my preference would be to kind of just wait and see it for a week. Moving over to the next game, we have the Bengals taking on the Browns. For the Bengals here, I think it's pretty obvious. You're firing up Jamar Chase easily, and you're also going to be firing up T. Higgins as a solid like fringe wide receiver 1. I will be sitting Tyler Boyd. I think Boyd becomes interesting if one of these top 2 go down, but I don't think he's someone you want to rely on for like week-to-week production. Then for the Browns, I think Amari Cooper is a pretty clear start. I went back and forth on Elijah Moore for whether or not I was going to put him as a fringe option or a sit. I ended up going with a sit for Elijah Moore. I do think you could argue a fringe play. I just think in week 1, you probably drafted him as like your wide receiver 4, your wide receiver 5. If you went super heavy at other positions, maybe he's like your wide receiver 3. But I do think we're in a spot here with Elijah Moore where I really like him throughout the season. I do think he's going to break out, be the clear wide receiver 2 on this team. If Deshaun Watson bounces back, I think Elijah Moore is going to be a great option this season. But I would just rather see it for a week, so I did end up going with a sit with Elijah Moore. And then Donovan Peoples-Jones, also going to be a sit for me. We have the Jaguars taking on the Colts up next, and I am very high on Calvin Ridley. This is not a situation where I'm going to need to see him play a game first. He's like a, fringe wide receiver 1 in my rankings, so I'm firing him up as a start. I have Christian Kirk as a fringe option. I think he's a really nice flex play. If he went heavy at other positions and he's your wide receiver 2, I also don't think that's too bad. I just think he's a little bit capped in terms of his ceiling. Since I am very high on Ridley, I do think he's going to be their clear-cut wide receiver 1. Christian Kirk, maybe his ceiling is a little bit limited. Also have Zay Jones there, who is a very competent receiver, and then Evan Ingram thrown in there also. There's a lot of weapons on this team, so Christian Kirk is going to be a fringe play, and then sitting Zay Jones. On the other side with the Colts, I went back and forth with Michael Pittman as a start and a fringe option. Ended up settling with him as a fringe play. I just think first week, Anthony Richardson making his NFL debut, we'll just see how that goes. Maybe he struggles a little bit early on, which obviously could hurt Michael Pittman. So not someone who I'm overly excited to throw into my lineup, but I think if he's your flex option, wide receiver 2, 3, I think you're fine. And then going to be sitting Alec Pierce and Josh Downs. I really liked Josh Downs as a prospect. I think he's interesting throughout the season. We'll see if he's able to break out, but definitely not someone who, should be played here in week 1. Moving over to the Buccaneers taking on the Vikings. I think this is a pretty interesting matchup overall. Starting off with the Vikings here, I ended up listing both Chris Godwin and Mike Evans as starts. It's been pretty widely talked about that both of these guys have taken massive hits in their redraft value after Brady retired. If Brady returned for this season, both these dudes would probably be getting drafted as top 12 guys, at worst high-end wide receiver 2s, but you go from Brady to Baker Mayfield, definitely a fall off. But I think if you drafted these guys, this is a matchup that you have to feel pretty good about. The Vikings allowed the second most points per game to wide receivers last season. They were in a ton of shootouts. If the Bucs end up struggling to put up points in this game, it may end up being a rough season. But I do think if you drafted these guys, this is definitely the spot where you should feel comfortable throwing them into your lineup. And then on the other side with the Vikings, obviously Justin Jefferson, my wide receiver 1. You're clearly starting him, every single week locked in. And then looking at their other 2 wide receivers, Jordan Addison and KJ Osborne, I'm very in on Jordan Addison this season. I think I had him as a top 36 wide receiver in my rankings, but I would just kind of temper my expectations early on. Not a huge fan of him here in week 1. I wouldn't be surprised if he started off playing behind KJ Osborne. We saw Jordan Addison play in the preseason, which makes sense because he's a rookie, but I do not believe we saw KJ Osborne play, which might mean he's lined up as the wide receiver 2 to start off the season. These rookie wide receivers are typically bets that are going to pay off in the back half of the season. So if you drafted Jordan Addison and he doesn't, have great usage or put up great production early on, I wouldn't panic. I think he's definitely more of a long-term play, but someone who I'd prefer to keep on my bench early on until we start to see him kind of break out there. And then also going to be sitting KJ Osborne, even if he's operating as the wide receiver 2. I just don't know if he's talented enough to really kind of take advantage of that role. Moving over to the Titans taking on the Saints. I think this Titans wide receiver room is very interesting. I think D-Hop is someone you fire up as a start. Not overly high on DeAndre Hopkins this season, but I still think he's very startable. I really like Treylon Burks. I think he's going to have a nice year 2 breakout here. I do have him as a sit. He's back at practice. Not sure if he's going to end up suiting up for this game. Even if he plays, I would just kind of rather wait and see, make sure he's back to 100%. And then we can, kind of reevaluate heading into week 2. On the other side with the Saints, I have Chris Olave locked in as a start, and then I have Michael Thomas as a fringe option. I think you could argue him as a sit or a fringe option. The way that I look at it is that if you have a healthy Michael Thomas, I think he's someone that you can throw into your lineup. Obviously, the concern here is whether or not he's going to be able to stay healthy, but if he's heading into week 1 healthy, I think he's definitely someone you could throw into your flex spot. And then I'm going to be sitting their wide receiver 3, Rashid Shaheed. Moving over to the 49ers, taking on the Steelers. For the 49ers, definitely going to be firing up Deebo Samuel as a start. I am lower on Deebo than consensus, but I still think he's definitely startable. Probably a little bit lower on Brandon Ayuk also. I have him as a fringe play. I know some people really, really love Brandon Ayuk, and I'm not like anti-Ayuk as a player. I actually think he's like a much better player than where I have him ranked for fantasy. There are just a lot of mouths to feed in this offense. Deebo, Ayuk, CMC, George Kittle, a lot of weapons, a lot of mouths to feed. There's going to be a lot of touches kind of dispersed throughout this offense. And I just don't love relying on Brandon Ayuk week to week. I think Ayuk's upside comes in if some injuries come into play. If Deebo goes down, Ayuk's value shoots up. I think even if a guy like Kittle goes down, CMC goes down, injuries to this offense are going to benefit Brandon Ayuk, obviously barring like Purdy, the quarterback position going down. But I think week 1, fringe option, flex, I think he's solid, but I don't have him as like a locked-in start where I'm feeling fantastic. On the other side with the Steelers, Deontay Johnson's going to be a start for me. I'm very high on Deontay. I think he's going to retain that wide receiver 1 spot, and if Kenny Pickett takes a leap, I think Deontay Johnson can bounce back into like that top 20 wide receiver territory. I also have George Pickens here as a fringe play. Probably a little bit lower on Pickens than consensus. I know some people think he's going to overtake Deontay Johnson. I can't get there, but I still think he'll be a decent flex option for you this season and could build throughout the year. And then sitting Allen Robinson, just not a player I'm super interested in for fantasy. I kind of feel like he's a little bit cooked at this point. In the next game, we have the Cardinals taking on the Commanders. Kind of a gross matchup here, in general. But starting off with the Cardinals, I have Marquise Brown as a fringe play. We still do not know who the quarterback is going to be for this team. They cut Colt McCoy. Don't really know what's going on with Kyler, but Kyler's definitely not starting this one. So Marquise Brown is going to be a fringe play. I think he's their clear-cut wide receiver 1, but, you just can't feel confident in this offense. I think they have one of, if not the lowest implied total points, so not a great look here for the Cardinals. On the other side with the Commanders, not really sure what's going on here with Terry McLaurin. It seems still like it's up in the air whether or not he's going to play in week 1. I'll say that if Terry McLaurin misses, Jahan Dotson is like a locked-in start for me. I think he's a great play. If McLaurin is active and it looks like he's 100%, no limitations, I'd have Terry as a start. Jahan Dotson probably would get bumped down to like a fringe play. If Terry's in some weird kind of like in-between situation where he's potentially limited, then that's just a situation we're going to have to evaluate closer to game day. But right now, I like Jahan Dotson if McLaurin is out. If McLaurin is good to go, really like McLaurin. And then I still think Jahan Dotson is like playable in your flex. Going to be sitting Curtis Samuel regardless. Then moving over to a divisional matchup here between the Packers and the Bears. I just have these 2 wide receiver 1s as starts. Christian Watson, very high on him heading into year 2. Fire him up. For the Bears, starting DJ Moore and then sitting Darnell Mooney and Chase Claypool. Then we have the Raiders taking on the Broncos. For the Raiders here, obviously you're firing up Devontae Adams. I think Jacoby Myers is someone who could be interesting throughout the season once we start to have some, more injuries, bye weeks, all of that stuff. But in week 1, I'd hope you have a better option over Jacoby Myers, and then also going to be sitting Hunter Renfrow. For the Broncos here, it does not look like Jerry Jeudy is going to be ready for week 1. Some people may have thought that Jeudy injury would just automatically, leap Cortland Sutton up to a locked-in start. that's just not really how I view wide receivers. It's very different than the running back position. You can't just be handed volume as a wide receiver. You have to earn it. Not saying Courtland Sutton can't do that, but there was a reason why people were so much higher on Jerry Jeudy compared to Courtland Sutton. So I think Sutton's going to be a fringe option for me. I think he's a very nice flex. If you're like someone who had Jeudy and maybe also Sutton, like I think he's a solid play. But it's not like I'm expecting Sutton to just come in and give you like locked in top 20 wide receiver production. I think we have to wait and see. I have Marvin Mims as a sit, but I do think Marvin Mims is very interesting. If he's not rostered in your league, he's someone I would definitely be looking into. I really liked him as a prospect. He was kind of stepping into a very crowded wide receiver room when you had Tim Patrick, KJ Hamler, Jerry Jeudy. All those guys are healthy. Now Tim Patrick out for the season. Hamler, I believe, was released, and now Jeudy injured. So that depth chart completely opened up for Marvin Mims, and he may be able to make an impact very early on in the season. In the next game, we have probably one of the more intriguing matchups of the week, the Dolphins taking on the Chargers, and I have 4 total starts in this matchup. Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle locked in every single week. And then I also think Keenan Allen and Mike Williams are also very strong plays as like wide receiver 2s. Quentin Johnston is a guy I'm very interested in, like season long for fantasy. Same thing I've talked about with some of these other rookies, but I would not be surprised if he plays as like the wide receiver 4 in this game. I don't even know if he's going to be in there on 3 wide receiver sets. We'll wait and see. I definitely think Quentin Johnston is more of a long-term play. Another guy who in the back half of the season, that's kind of where you're looking for him to really break out. In the next game, we have the Eagles taking on the Patriots. Kind of a tale of 2 different wide receiver rooms. For the Eagles, you're obviously firing up A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith. Both great options. And then for the Patriots, I think Juju is someone who could become like a fringe option week to week. But in week 1, with no bye weeks, limited injuries, I would hope you have a better option, 2, 3 better wide receivers than Juju. So then also going to be sitting Devonta Parker and Kendrick Bourne. Then we have the Rams taking on the Seahawks. And for the Rams here, Cooper Kupp's status for week 1 seems to be up in the air. If he's active, he's someone I'm going to fire up as a strong start. And then if Cooper Kupp does not play, this is not a spot where I'm like considering Van Jefferson or Ben Skoranek because they're going to, take over Cooper Kupp's work. If Kupp is out, this offense is probably going to be pretty miserable, and I'm just not interested in starting Van Jefferson or Ben Skoranek. On the other side with the Seahawks, a very stacked wide receiver room. DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, love these guys as week-to-week starts. And then I have JSN as a fringe option. He's back at practice after his wrist injury, so it seems possible that he could play in this game. That's why I have him as a fringe option. Maybe he's limited. Maybe he doesn't even end up giving it a go. But another player who is someone who, is going to probably pay off in the back half of the season, similar to Jordan Addison, Quentin Johnston, guys like that. But I still think he, can be a solid producer in week 1. I just think, the peak is going to be later on in the year. I believe this is the Sunday night game, the Cowboys taking on the Giants. For the Cowboys, I think CeeDee Lamb, pretty obvious, locked in as a start. I think Brandon Cooks is an interesting fringe option. We'll see how he kind of looks, with the Cowboys in his first year here. But I think he's a decent flex play. Maybe you have a better option week 1. That's also cool. But he's going to be a fringe for me. And then sitting Michael Gallup. It'll be interesting to see what Michael Gallup looks like a year removed from the ACL, but I do think right now he's going to be slotting in as their number 3. On the other side with the Giants, this is a wide receiver room that is pretty all over the place. Isaiah Hodgins, Darius Slayton, Paris Campbell, Jalen Hyatt. You can throw Sterling Shepard in there. Also Wan'Dale Robinson, but I do not believe he's back from his ACL tear. So we'll see how this wide receiver room shakes out. I believe the top 3 right now are Hodgins, Slayton, Campbell. Jalen Hyatt probably gets in there sometime later in the season. But week 1, I hope you do not have to rely on any of these guys in your lineup. And then the final game of the week, Monday Night Football, Bills taking on the Jets. I'm just going to be firing up both of these teams' wide receiver 1s as starts and then sitting the rest. So Stephon Diggs locked in. Some people may like Gabe Davis. For me, you look at Gabe Davis, he's very boom or bust, and he's a lot more bust than boom if we're being honest here. And so week 1 with no bye weeks, I would hope you have like 3 better wide receivers than Gabe Davis, or even if you don't have like 3 better ones, you have better options at other positions to throw into your flex over him. And then for the Jets, Garrett Wilson, locked in, wide receiver 1 for me, sitting Allen Lazard. there's this probably going to be, common theme throughout the season where I'm just looking at Garrett Wilson in terms of this Jets wide receiver room, unless they go out and end up making a move somewhere else. But that's going to wrap it up for my wide receiver start sits. If you guys enjoyed the video, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. If you haven't seen the running backs, go check that out. And then if you guys are interested, the quarterbacks and tight ends, those videos will be out tomorrow. I'll also be going through my running back rankings and my wide receiver rankings for week 1. That'll be, closer to the Thursday night game. But that's going to wrap it up for me here in this video. Thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.